Well, thank you all for coming. Can you hear me okay?
Yes.
Dr. Kotz is going to be speaking without a microphone, but I have every confidence he can project that voice because he was a colonel in ROTC, so he's used to doing that. Professor Kotz is a teacher at St. Mary's University. He has a PhD. He's a lifelong career educator, and he's also one of my oldest and dearest friends. So it's absolutely an honor for me to introduce you to him. I think you're in for a real treat. Professor Kotz.
I appreciate that, Pauline. Can you hear me okay, everybody? This is important. Let me know if I need to amp it up a little bit. I've given this talk a few times, and I must tell you, it was really exciting to research. This is about not necessarily the U.S. Constitution, that is a piece of it, but it's the history of women who have run for the presidency. I don't know if you realize, but we have never, ever had a woman as a nominee in the major two parties. That is in the Democrat and Republican parties. If you look at other parties that have been throughout time, from the 1870s to today, there have been nominees, and I'd like to show you a glimpse into the character and the strength of these individuals. It's an interesting piece. I chose this slide because you'll see, of course, I know many of you remember Rosie the Riveter, right? Yes. Oh, welcome. Come on in. We have a few more.
We have one more lady coming.
Oh, excellent. Also, here was an ad for the first individual to run for the presidency. Her name was Victoria Woodhull, and we'll describe her in depth here coming up. And also, of course, Wonder Woman for president. We have a lot of individuals that took it upon themselves to say, look, I've got the ability to run this country. All right. Well, I thought this talk would be timely with an upcoming election, but of course we've had the Pope here, and I've heard there's water on Mars. All right, so we've had a lot of things happen, so why is this even important? And I heard today, through Pauline and others, that you had Denver omelets, casserole muffins, and fresh fruit, and I missed it. I was hoping that I'd get an invite to have some lunch. All right, but you have a very nice facility here, and I'm glad to be here today. Why am I doing this? I get this question a lot. I was asked by some of my students, has there ever been a woman nominated for president? Secondly, I try to raise independent thinking daughters. I have a son who's in the Air Force right now, stationed in California. I have two daughters. Both have just been married in these last 2 years. And I try to raise them as independent thinking individuals who I believe have the capability to do amazing things in our world and look in a society that values their contributions. Third, my mom, who's come to one of my presentations, Pauline knows of her. She had a bumper sticker which read, "Women are natural born leaders, you're following one." So she was one of those individuals who had an instrumental effect on me when I was a kid.
She should have run for president.
She would have been a good one, I think. They would have been digging up some of her past, though. And I also believe it's important that we research, understand, and report how far we've progressed as a nation. And look in terms of equality and some of the challenges we still face. And finally, I enjoy studying and communicating findings about history. Another reason is she was 5 years old at the time of this taping, but Macy Hensley is an interesting individual, and hopefully I can get this to work.
From Council Grove, Kansas, please welcome back 5-year-old Macy Hensley. Are people recognizing you since you've been on television?
Yes.
Yeah? What's that like?
It's fun at times, but there's times when I just get tired of it.
You just want to be left alone? Yeah. What do people say? Do they just come up to you?
They want my picture or my autograph, and it's just like, okay, I'm fine. I'm not selling that stuff.
That is true. You're 5, but you're a very mature 5, don't you think? You're really smart. And the last time you were here, you didn't have an Abraham Lincoln costume, and we gave it to you.
Yes.
And I saw pictures of you in it, and they're adorable. Look at you and Abraham. Look at that. And so you want to be president, and then there's something else that I heard you want to do. Tell everybody what that is.
They're trying to put a woman on the Jackson.
Right.
I think they should wait a few years and put my picture on the Jackson.
I agree with you. I think we should put, yeah, because there's not a woman on any paper money. We have coins, but we don't have any paper. So I think, don't you think it's a good idea to have a woman on a $20 bill?
Yes.
And so we'll wait for you to become president to do that?
Yeah.
All right, good. And I actually think you could become president. And we sent you to the White House and you had a tour. Was that fun?
It was the best day ever.
Really? I bet it was. I bet it was. All right, well, let's take a look together. Let's see what happens.
It's me, Macy, and I'm about to go in the White House.
From Council Room.
The green room. There's James Polk.
You're right.
And Abigail Adams. And William Harrison. Benjamin Harrison. Oh, and there's Andrew Jackson. At Andrew Jackson's funeral, his parrot was saying bad words.
You get an idea about Macy, and she is another reason she inspires me, because she is an individual who's only 6 years old, and yet she's got an incredible knowledge of the history of the presidents. But she doesn't know very much about women that have run. And so I'd like to talk to that kid someday soon. All right? Well, you go back, a little history for you. Yes, the Declaration of Independence in 1776. How does it begin? Does anybody know?
When in the course of human events.
Excellent. Yes, it becomes necessary for one people to dissolve the political bands which have connected them to one another. And that's the first paragraph, and we could go on, right? Do you know what the second paragraph is? Not many of us do know as Americans. Anybody?
We the people of the United States. No. We
Very
don't.
close. We hold these truths to be self-evident that all men are created equal, and they're endowed by their Creator with certain unalienable rights. And among these are,
Life, liberty, and the pursuit of happiness.
that one we usually know, right?
Right.
That's embedded in our characters as U.S. citizens. Okay, well the Constitution comes up 11 years later, and we the people of the United States, in order to form a more perfect union, that was from the preamble at the beginning, right at the beginning, right? Well, there were 7 articles in the Constitution, and I don't want to bore you to tears with each one, but it's important to see some of these pieces. They included, interesting, we all know we're in a presidential election coming up, the legislative branch, the executive branch, the judicial branch, and then these other ones, relation to the states to one another and how they interacted, amending the Constitution, dealing with national debt, and then changing or ratifying it. Amendments to the Constitution. Just so you know, there were 12 amendments. Do you know what the amendments 3 through 12 are called, by any chance?
Bill of Rights.
Excellent, that's right, the Bill of Rights. And the first 2 amendments, with a little refreshment of the memory, do you know what they are? What's number 1? Freedom of religion, speech in the press, and the right of assembly and petition. And what's number 2?
Yes. Right to bear arms.
Right to bear arms, right? But, as our gentleman mentioned, 3 through 12 became the Bill of Rights. All right, there's specific amendments, and there's tons of them. There have been 27 amendments that have been ratified. And what the point of this talk is looking at some of the 19th Amendment, which was, anyone?
Suffrage.
Yes, women's suffrage. And the right to vote. All right. Now, interestingly enough, it was proposed in 1919 and then ratified in 1920, which leads into our topic, and specifically, without getting too technical, Article 2, Section 1, the Constitution and the Presidency. Maybe you were aware of this, but all of you could run, I believe. No person except a natural-born citizen or a citizen of the U.S. at the time of the adoption of the Constitution shall be eligible. Neither shall any person be eligible who shall not have attained to the age of 35 years, all right, and have been a resident for 14. All right. In reality, though, the states control the voting requirements, and these major political parties nominations that were attained in those early years. Okay, and 1789 is when it came out. All right, so we're here to look at the women who run for president. And initially, when I put this together, I was looking at the women who have been nominated for president. Okay, as we mentioned earlier, in the two major parties, we have never had a female be nominated in the Democratic or Republican Party. Hillary Clinton came the closest in 2008. Do I have a political agenda? No. This is not an endorsement for the Republican or Democratic Party, or other parties for that matter. I was interested in the history of it all. And looking at some of the challenges these women ran through when they were acknowledging their, and also announcing their candidacy. So there you have it. We mentioned Hillary Clinton. She was our only one to actually seek that nomination and come closest. Well, we have had two vice presidential nominees. Do you know who they were?
Sarah Palin.
Excellent. Palin was one of them. And in 1984, Geraldine Ferraro was immensely popular. Very good. So, but they weren't presidential. All right, vice presidential. But Sarah Palin was very popular in her own right in 2008. Okay, what's a nominee? Nominees are those who are nominated or selected by the political parties for offices. And they're women who have achieved ballot access in at least one state. Some of this was done by paper ballots, as well as electronic today. As far as my research indicates, 35 women, at least, have run for the president of the USA. Depending on who you talk to and the different research I found, I think it's more like 40 plus. But it's not as though women haven't tried. All right? We even had a party called the Surprise Party, which I'll refer to coming up. All right? A true party that existed. Although it can generate some amusement in the name, it's nonetheless true that women mounted platforms had a lot of courage. So let's take a look at some of the candidates. Are we good so far? Everybody in good shape? Anybody taking a nap? We'll make sure I'm not boring you. Okay. So we go. Victoria Woodhull, first candidate, 1872. She ran under the Equal Rights Party. And her running mate was Frederick Douglass, who was also an abolitionist, as many of you must know. He wasn't very active in her candidacy, but she was the first candidate for president of the U.S. She was an activist for women's rights and labor reforms. And also, in her time, this was kind of outlandish, but she advocated free love. She also thought that you should be able to marry, divorce freely, and bear children without government interference. This is in 1872, mind you. I don't do this for all of the people, but it's interesting because she was the first. She was born in 1838, came out of Ohio. You find a lot of good candidates coming out of Ohio. I don't know why that is. Maybe it's something in the water. But no doubt, she lived a pretty good life. And you can see her longevity there. She had some colorful nicknames and occupations. She was a suffragist activist. She was one of the first stockbroker businesswomen. She was a writer and, of course, presidential candidate. She was involved, forgive me, a role in a sex scandal involving Henry Ward Beecher. She wasn't actively involved in the scandal, she reported it. All right? She was known as Victoria California Claflin, Wicked Woodhull, and other names. With her sister Tennessee, they were very good and astute financially. And so and both of them worked on one of the newspapers too, in the local area. Many people question the legality of her run, mainly because she was younger than the constitutionally mandated age of 35. So her candidacy didn't have as many legs at the time, but she was an interesting individual. And I have some other notes I would share with you, and depending on our time, I'd be glad to. But the interesting thing about her is she was the fifth of 7 kids, and she She probably would have been able to run with Frederick Douglass successfully, but there was a problem at that time. The suffragists were trying to reunite with the African American rights activists, and what happened is there was an exclusion of female suffrage from the 15th Amendment 2 years earlier, and it caused a rift between the two groups. And so Frederick Douglass wasn't really on the same page as she was either, so it didn't help her candidacy, even though he was going to be the vice president. She was self-educated from the get-go, had very little formal schooling. She made her fortune basically on the road as a highly successful magnetic healer. So she was a magnetic healer, can you imagine that? Before she joined the spiritualist movement. So a lot of people at the time thought, you know, she's a magnetic healer, spiritualist, can she really run the country? They didn't really take her as credible, okay? But her sister and she started this brokerage firm on Wall Street, and were some of the first. And she was the first woman to found a newspaper. So this is the woman who ran for president for the first time. First woman to found a newspaper, and it was called Woodhull and Claflin Weekly. And they had their first publication in 1870. Interesting at this time too. Opposition to abortion, but there's some mixed message in here if you look at it. It's frequently cited by opponents of abortion when writing about first-wave feminism. The most common Woodhull quotations cited by opponents of abortion were, and here's what she said, "The rights of children as individuals begin while yet they remain the fetus." But yet, look at the second one. So there's a little bit of a paradox here if you ask me. Every woman knows that if she were free, she would never bear for an unwished for child, nor think of murdering one before its birth. So she was talking about some very controversial issues in the 1870s, right? And we had just finished the Civil War, and the country was still trying to heal from that. Does anybody know what eugenics is? Have you ever heard of eugenics? It took on kind of a bad name in World War II with Hitler, where they did experiments on people to make them a better human being physically. Well, she's an interesting individual here. She took stances. She really wanted people to marry well and have good prenatal care as a way to bear healthier children. But this is in 1870, not in World War II. And so one reason they think that she pushed eugenics so much is she had a son who suffered from mental retardation, and she really wanted to see him, along with other kids, live a better, good life. And so back then, eugenics took on a very good term. All right, here's the obscenity charges I mentioned about Henry Ward Beecher. She was arrested because she published an account of alleged adulterous affair between the minister, Henry Ward Beecher, who was also in the running for president, and Elizabeth Tilton. And it added to the sensational coverage of her candidacy. In all, Ms. Woodhull didn't receive any electoral votes, and there's conflicting evidence about popular votes, because it was by paper then. But she did a lot for the working class, and many of these reforms have been implemented and now taken for granted. And which brings us to our second individual, Belva Ann Lockwood. Some researchers would say she was the first, but she was one of the first that was recognized on a ballot, but she ran 2 times in 1884 and 1888 under the National Equal Rights Party. If you recall, Woodhull ran under the Equal Rights Party, so they just changed the name a little bit. A third party, right? Not Democrat or Republican. And she ran with a female running mate, but interestingly enough, that was her first time. In 1888, she chose 2 males to run. And this guy dropped out due to health reasons, and Mr. Wells stuck with her in 1888. Well, Belva Ann also lived to a healthy age from New York, and she was one of the first early women lawyers to practice, and very strong on her feet and in the courtroom. First one to practice before the Supreme Court of the U.S., and also the first woman to appear on official ballots as a candidate for U.S. president. And that's why many argue that she might have been the true first candidate. She argued for a lot of things, and I won't go through all of them, but just a little history. She looked at this as a time for more options for women. She was a principal at several local schools. They found that she had excellent leadership capabilities. She was good with the students loved her. Her philosophy gradually changed when she met Susan B. Anthony. Lockwood agreed that many of Anthony's ideas about society's restriction on women had to be changed. And she was concerned about the limited education girls received. You know, they were relegated to homemaker, seamstress, etc. All right? Comments? Questions? We doing well? All right. But a competent lawyer, she drafted an anti-discrimination bill. And interestingly enough, her practice was limited in the 1870s due to the social discrimination. Lockwood drafted this bill to have the same access to the bar as the male colleagues. And she wanted to have women and widows have more protection under the law in terms of property rights as well. So she did a lot for the United States. And a few things about Belva Ann that were a little further down the road when she was a little bit more advanced in years. But in 1908, Syracuse University gave her an honorary law doctorate. Back then, Ulysses S. Grant, who was president at the time, gave her an honorary doctorate for the work she had done in the legal field, but it wasn't truly recognized until Syracuse gave it to her. A portrait of her hangs in the National Gallery in Washington. A Liberty ship was named the Belva Lockwood in World War II, and she's still honored on a postage stamp from '86 in the Great American Series. So these individuals started to take prominence in being recognized, but it's still so early in our history. But here's the crazy thing. Women couldn't vote. So you've got two female candidates, strong candidates, very talented. Maybe the magnetic healing wasn't truly accepted, right, with the first one, but for what it's worth, they were strong, sharp, and knew what they were doing, yet women couldn't vote, so there was no basis for their backing. They were just relying on the male vote. So they had that disadvantage. Belva Ann did receive about 4,100 votes, which seemed minuscule comparatively today. All right. Male readers, forgive me, gentlemen, but they were worried about old lady Lockwood and petticoat rule could take place. All right. Men were worried at that time. So yes.
What if the Constitution would have said all men and women were created equal?
I agree with you, my dear. It was implied, you know, at that time it was implied, and unfortunately it wasn't always recognized. It was implied with the word men that it included men and women colloquially, but you're right. It would have been a better thing if they included both. I'm on the same page. Well, okay, realize, 1884, 1888, that was when Belva Ann ran, but it took a few years. 1920 is when the 19th Amendment kicked in, right? And that gave women the right to vote. But it would take 2 more decades after this for the next significant female presidential candidate to emerge. So they stood in the background after that. They just kind of said, you know, it doesn't seem like it's a reality at this time. So, another interesting piece of history. Although Americans, we think of ourselves as leaders in things progressive, and we do a lot of great things here. The fact is, 26 countries granted women the vote before the U.S. did. And the same is true of electing women as national leaders. And the U.S. falls behind some of the countries listed, even Pakistan. But the 19th Amendment did provide hope for female candidates in the presidential arena. Okay. Laura Clay, I bring her up because when the 19th Amendment was put into effect, she did not get a nomination, but I consider her a notable. She was considered a Democrat, all right, but didn't get the nomination. And said she was Jeffersonian. She was an interesting individual. She was for women's rights, but she wasn't for racial equality. Clay supported women's rights to education and to the vote. At the same time, she believed that black citizens were not yet developed enough. Okay? She did support, this is an interesting piece, educated women of all races getting the vote and spoke at times against ignorant white voters. She contributed at the same time to African American Church project aimed at self-improvement, but she wasn't quite on the page of saying that we're at equality for the races. Okay, so as we said, that was 1920. We fast forward to 1940. Do you remember Gracie Allen?
Yeah.
Well, she might have been the first comedian to run for president. Some say the first actor was Ronald Reagan or someone prior, but Gracie Allen literally, it was kind of a joke at first, but it got legs. And you'll notice it says, the campaign board, Gracie Allen, the surprise party's dark horse. A vote for Gracie is a vote for fun. 1940, right at the time of World War II, right? And Gracie Allen, you can see, she was beautiful. Who was she married to at the time?
George Burns.
George Burns, right? And they were quite a pair. And both multi-talented. And ultra-talented. Burns lived into his 90s, if you recall. But they did a whistle-stop tour and did a live radio show with their comedy and this presidency. And an interesting thing, I don't know if you know it, she says, I don't know much about the Lend-Lease bill, but if we owe it, we should pay it. Right? She said another typical Gracie thing was everybody knows a woman is better than a man when it comes to introducing bills into the house. Right? I don't know if you're not laughing at that. But back then, that was part of the humor. Her mascot was the kangaroo. The motto was, it's in the bag. You know? And it's interesting, way before her time, long before Pat Paulson ran for president, or this guy, this young kid named D's Nuts, he's running, he's like a young teenager. I think she was kind of a set a precedent for a comedian trying to run. Okay, 52, notice we go 12 years hence, and all I wanted to show you here, without getting into the detail of these individuals, is that there were 3 parties that emerged, different ones. Washington Peace, American Party, and American Woman's Party. Little is known of the candidates, but just take into account that these different parties were emerging, in addition to Democrat and Republican. Do you remember Margaret Chase?
Yeah.
Fascinating individual. She, whatever your party affiliation is, Democrat or Republican, she was a very interesting Republican candidate and sharp, but had a woman of supreme etiquette. She served as a Republican senator from Maine. First woman elected to both the House of Reps and the Senate. There you go. At the '64 convention, she became the first woman to have her name placed in nomination for president. And she was the one also that she was a very strong opponent of Senator McCarthy's tactics, the senator from Wisconsin. She didn't receive the nomination of her party. Barry Goldwater did earn it. But a few things from Margaret Chase. I could go on and on about some of the amazing things she said, in my opinion, for the time. By the way, who was president in '64? Who had the presidency by then?
Johnson.
Exactly, Johnson. Remember, 60 would have been Kennedy, and Johnson had taken over after Kennedy's death. But here's some of the things that Margaret said I thought were very witty and neat for her time. When people keep telling you you can't do something, you kind of like to try it. You know? Leadership is not manifested by forcing somebody or by coercion, even against the resented. Greatness is not manifested by unlimited pragmatism, which places such a high premium on the end justifying any means and any measures. And her last one, which may apply today, what do you think? One of the basic causes for all the trouble in the world today is that people talk too much and think too little. They act impulsively without thinking. She says, I always try to think before I talk. Well, here's what happened. Because, you know how we pull threads of words, because she said, I always try to, they started hammering on her for that one phrase. But she really was a person of principle. And really, bipartisan-wise, didn't care as much if her party didn't like what she had to say. So I considered her a very good leader at the time. Interesting, here's a button for when she ran in '64. It says, my sentiments are with Margaret Chase. And she talked about public service. It's more than doing a job efficiently and honestly. It's a complete dedication to the people and to the nation, with full recognition that every human being is entitled to courtesy and consideration. And it goes on. Okay, as I mentioned about the McCarthy issue, as a senator, she says, I'm not proud of the way in which the Senate has been a publicity platform for irresponsible sensationalism. Many people would argue today with CNN and Fox and our other news agencies, that we've made it all about sensationalism and not so much about what they have to say, but you be the judge. Okay, you remember now, that was 64. Charlene Mitchell comes into the fray. Now, she was a communist, all right? But she would be the first, from what my research shows, a lot of people think Shirley Chisholm was the first individual to run as a black American or African American. It was actually Charlene Mitchell. And she ran with a male running mate. And she joined that Communist Party at age 16. Very influential leader. But you know what? She mellowed, but still stayed part of this party. Here's her today. She's still alive. Civil rights activism in '43 was one of her major deals. And one of the things I remember in the research, Windsor Theater, customers were segregated in '43. Black customers in the balcony, and also a nearby segregated bowling alley. Well, it didn't quite work the first time, but they tried it again, and they had a sit-in with white members going up to the colored-only section, and while black members took their seats in the white-only section, and it was very effective. She still does activism today, but a very kind woman, still thriving. You'll notice, I like to show you some of the buttons, because here's Zagarel, who is a running mate, and Mitchell, again, they ran into the issue because of age. And it wasn't her this time, it was a running mate. He was 23 years of age, and he was younger than the constitutionally required age of 35. So there was some contestation there. But to be frank with you, the Communist Party really wouldn't take hold in this country very much. But it's interesting nonetheless. There's Shirley. Shirley Chisholm, and if you recall, 72, when she ran, she was the first woman to run for the Democratic presidential nomination, as well as the first major black candidate. And when I say major again, because Charlene was in a third party. Okay? She came in fourth where George McGovern won the Democratic nomination. But she had some interesting things to say. We live in revolutionary times in '72. Who was our president in '72?
Nixon.
Yeah, Richard Milhouse Nixon. All right. Again, rights, civil rights were huge on her list. The shackles that various groups have worn for centuries are being cast off. She made the interesting comment: India, Ceylon, and Israel have women for prime ministers and other decision making. American women have to stand and fight, be militant even, for rights which are ours. She was a viable candidate. She entered 11 primaries and campaigned in 11 states. Particularly Florida was strong in her backcourt. But again, with little money, it was difficult to get a candidacy be aggressive. But look, she received 151 of the delegates' votes, which was unheard of in previous years. Interesting thing about Shirley, she wanted to be remembered by this: when I die, I want to be remembered as a woman who lived in the 20th century and who dared to be a catalyst of change. And you could read on a very similar one too, reflecting on her as a black woman. Okay, interestingly enough, she's notable. Patsy Takemoto Mink. In '72, a group of liberal Democrats in Oregon asked her to be the presidential candidate. She was on the ballot, and she only got 2% of the vote. But the reason I bring her up, in '72, she was the first woman of color to serve in the U.S. Congress, but it was the work she did there that should be remembered, I think. She, prior to the election, had been absent from national politics, worked tirelessly because her mom and dad were held in some of the camps in California as Japanese Americans. They didn't suffer as harsh as some had in concentration camps, but she knew what it was like not to have your basic background respected. So she fought for that. Linda Janis. I'm not a socialist or a communist, I want to make it clear. This is important though. Linda Janis ran in '72 under the Socialist Workers' Party. And the thing that's interesting, just by contrast, she had a good following. She got 83,000 votes. The picture, it seems so small compared to what Nixon had. He had 47 million of the popular vote. But she was recognized. And interesting thing about Janice, she was the first individual. She fought for making sure that you would get media coverage. In an FCC case, third-party candidates were not allowed to be focused on in the media, as well as the first two. So she pushed for that and was able to win that case. Again, age 31, she did meet the constitutional requirement, but they let her on the ballot anyway. All right, so far so good. We're moving forward. Any comments? Okay. Evelyn Reed, also 72, had a lot of individuals, and she was part of the Trotskyist movement, and she would be an interesting one to look at. But the reason I bring her up, she and Janice were kind of neck and neck for a while, and then Janice took over for that party. Okay. She supported workers' rights as well. Margaret Wright, 76. She ran with the famous Benjamin Spock. You remember Spock? Yeah. Not the guy in Star Trek, right? This is the baby doctor, right? Under the People's Party. And it didn't work out as well for Margaret Wright. But she was, she's an activist first and foremost. You're welcome. She was a shipyard worker during World War II, and she was one of the principals of the film For the Life and Times of Rosie the Riveter. So when you see that picture of Rosie, you think of Marlene Wright. She was instrumental in getting that news out. And again, she didn't have a big candidacy as well. All right, 76, Ellen McCormick runs under the Right to Life Party, and she was interesting because she was pro-life completely, and she said, abortion is put forth as a solution for the poor, but I think the poor want better housing, more jobs, and food on their tables. I don't think aborting their babies makes them any happier. I think it probably contributes to their misery. So she ran on that platform, and somewhat successfully. And it all stemmed from the Roe v. Wade decision in '73. That was one of her catalysts for running. She wanted to overturn the court's ruling. She became the first, this is an interesting piece, first female presidential candidate to qualify for federal campaign funding. So up to that time, up to '76, women did not get campaign funding. They had to support it on their own or through friends. And so that was tough. And one other thing, one other reason, she was the first one to get Secret Service protection. So things were starting to change, but it took a long time. Again, 80, we won't go through each individual, but Ellen ran again, third under the Right to Life Party. The Peace and Freedom Party was Maureen Smith, and then Deidre Griswold ran under the Workers' World Party. Okay, time is flying, we're in the 80s now. Two candidates from third parties. Once again, we had an individual. I wanted to talk a little bit about Sonia here. Sonia Johnson from the Citizens Party and Gabrielle Holmes. Now, interesting thing about Sonia. She was the first Mormon candidate I've seen. She said, initially, she's kind of a paradox, because she changed some of her views. But she says, I'm a feminist to the core and will be until I die, fiercely, passionately, reverently, and totally committed to the justice for my sisters on this earth. Now, this is the interesting thing. I feel, frankly, as if I had been born in this time because I've always felt this way, even in pre-existence. So, this is the right time for me. I feel as if I've come home. Well, she was a huge ERA proponent, but she was a fifth-generation Mormon. And she was a professor, a mother of four, and she knew little about running until she became uneasy that her church was opposing something with a name as beautiful as the Equal Rights Amendment. So she eventually led Johnson, that led her to run for the presidency. But I have to tell you, before I move on, she became somewhat jaded in her views because she fought so hard for the Equal Rights Amendment, but found out later that it just wasn't moving forward because, you know, did the Equal Rights Amendment ever pass? No, it never did. And so she became disillusioned and said, you know, I give up. I don't think I can take it any further. So there's some very good books written about Miss Johnson. If you get a chance, it's a good read. 88, two notable candidates. Again, I bring them up because I wanted to just let you see how the votes start changing. Lenore Fulani has run multiple times under the New Alliance Party, and then Willa Knoyer under the Socialist Party. Okay, Fulani, she was really wanted to make sure that influence and corruption in the two-party system was minimized, or if not eradicated. Pat Schroeder, you may know of her as well, but she was a character and funny. In a way, she said, imagine a picture of the House floor of 406 women and 28 men, with a Senate floor with 98 women and 2 men. Flip-flopper, right? She became first congresswoman, that was for Colorado. And she, her campaign in 1988 was based on her belief that America is man enough to back a woman. Well, ERA came up again, all right? And as a co-founder of Congressional Caucus for Women's Issues, she became a Democratic whip. She was the lead sponsor of the ERA amendment, as well as other legislation to secure women's rights in employment, education, and finance. And you can see one of the buttons that was out at the time. Okay? But she had that sense of humor. And she says, the reason I'm running, she says, what choice do I have? Right? She didn't think the other candidates were the best at the time. But interesting comment. She reflected that more women would run if they only knew their history and could make realistic use of those stepping stones. All right. Now there was kind of a dearth of candidates from 92 to 2008. So we're getting to the present here soon. You can tell, the reason I bring this up, just look at the different parties. And you would even see these on Minnesota election ballots. Sometimes, I think in this election we'll see up to 9 of the different parties when we come up in 2016. But New Alliance, Socialist, Workers' World, but here's some of the ones that came up as you've seen that are interesting. Independent, Green Party again, and then Liberation parties. So those started to emerge in that time frame. A notable, Miss Dole, Elizabeth Hanford Dole. Women share the men with the need for personal success, even the taste of power, and she wanted to be a role model. She was listed as the most likely to succeed, running under a Republican ticket. Her husband had some issues that probably derailed her campaign a bit. They never had any children together, Robert Dole and her, but when the Democrats won the White House in '76, she was out of office in '83, and Reagan appointed her to be the head of the DOT, and the department was less than 20 years old, and she was the first woman to hold that top position. Unfortunately, the statistics said that media coverage confirmed that she was a victim of the old habit of focusing on a woman's personal qualities with female candidates and not on the issues. She had a great style where she would go into the audience and meet people individually, but they thought that was more about style and not substance. Unfortunately, they said it didn't help her campaign, according to the pundits. All right, 2004, another notable, Kara Mosley Braun. She was interesting, considered the year of the woman in '92. Many female voters came out to show their disagreement with the outcome of the Clarence Thomas Anita Hill proceedings. Maybe you recall that in the 90s. But she was the first, hit the trifecta here, first American woman elected to the U.S. Senate, and first American senator to be elected as a Democrat, and the first woman elected to the Senate from Illinois. So she was able to do all three. Very strong candidate, although, long story short, she announced her run at Howard University in 2003. She acknowledged it would be a long shot. She didn't think that this meant she could not win, and argued her experience in local, state, and national government would make her well-rounded. But you'll notice that in Illinois, she's looking at 53% of the vote. Okay, which brings us to 2008. Hillary Rodham Clinton. The interesting thing, under the Democratic Party ticket, Clinton received more than 17 million votes during the Democratic National Convention, but trailed Barack Obama by 103 delegates at the final tally. She was the first lady to hold a postgraduate degree from Yale and to run for and be elected senator in 2000 for New York. Hillary came close, as we mentioned earlier in the presentation, to winning the nomination. and there's a good chance that in 2016 she will. Who is she running against right now? Who is she in the Democratic Party? Who are the main candidates with Hillary? Bernie Sanders and those are the who's it? Yeah, Martin O'Malley, right? O'Malley, and then the other guy Webb dropped out. So it seems like those three, right? Yeah, that's what I'm hearing too, and what I can tell. But she kind of broke the cash ceiling, raised $212 million, which was unheard of in that year. And that's been one of the biggest impediments for women candidates, for any candidate for that matter. So we'll be interesting to see what she does. McKinney did not announce her candidacy in this year, but she's been waiting in the wings. She's from the Green Party, but she did in 2008 and acquired quite a bit of votes. Interesting thing for people of color in here, that's always an issue. He always says, they look at me and see a black woman, they say she's got to be another Maxine Waters, a fiery liberal from LA. I don't mind being another Maxine Waters when it comes to the strength and force of advocacy, but to judge me by my entirety by what I look like is quite base. So that's always been a challenge too for people of color. But she's considered 2016, very sharp individual. Jill Stein, 2012. I gotta say, she had quite a following for the Green Party. And she ran with Sherry Hunkela. She's the most successful third-party female presidential candidate in terms of aggregate votes to run. And I don't know if you know, do you know who this is on the bottom? Who is this? Roseanne who?
Oh, yeah.
Roseanne Barr,
Yeah.
the comedian. I don't know if you know, they considered running together and then they flip-flopped. Let's see in 2012 what happened. Of course, Michelle Bachmann ran, right? And then withdrew. But Roseanne Barr ran into the Green Party as the main ticket, and then Jill Stein became her running mate. I know, who knew? But they never received a nomination. Okay, we're almost there. Carly Fiorina, along with Hillary Clinton, are the female candidates running in 2016. She announced her candidacy and she's thoroughly educated in business administration and marketing. She served in executive positions for AT&T, Lucent Technology, and the chief exec officer of Hewlett Packard, HP. So she's got the experience from the business sector as well and has done fairly well in the debates so far. So in 2016, we only have 2 women candidates. Is that true? That's what I saw. The research indicated that these are all the women who are running. But we don't hear about all of them. Of course, we have Carly Fiorina. And by the way, still, because the nominations have not been fully put in place, they probably will be, they'll probably be a little bit later in January. But 38 Republicans are running right now, men and women. Of course, Hillary Clinton, there are 19 Democratic candidates, even though we hear of Bernie Sanders, Hillary, and then Mr. O'Malley. Jill Stein we mentioned. Well, the only thing as far as I can tell from the research is that there is only one Green Party candidate, and that is her. Sam Tittle is an independent. There are 21 independent candidates running, not Democrat or Republican. And Libertarian, there are 6. Joy Waymeyer is one of them. Shauna Sterling, and she would go in with that group of the 38. And Lynn Sandra Khan, an independent, along with these. And then finally, Tammy Stainfield, an independent. So there are many candidates, and in fact, at this time, as of yesterday, we have 95 people running for president right now that are on the ballot. But of course, what we see in the media, we see usually the top 10 or 12, right, on the Republican end. But it's interesting to know that all the people that are there, but if they don't have enough backing or the media background, they may not even get a chance. So with that, I'll leave it to you. Do you have any questions at all or comments? Did I go too long?
No.
That's pretty good. All right. Anything at all?
Paul, can you speak to what motivates these people who perhaps don't even have a shot at getting elected? Why do they stay in it?
Oh, that's a good question. I don't know if I have the complete answer, but what I can tell from the research on all these individuals, men and women, but in particular women, is that they found that, number one, they wanted to see a change be made. All right. Number two, they always have a strong sense of confidence in them that they may not make all the right decisions, but they know that they will have people that will support them in it, and they're willing to take that decision and live with it. So, to answer your question, I think it's about, number one, there's a need for a change, and two, they have that immense confidence. And there's an ability there that's undefinable. Some people have that charisma too that makes them want to run, and people flock to them. So I think that's another piece that's important too. Anything else?
Can you just talk a little bit about third-party candidates?
Sure.
Do you think that in the next 25 years that's something we might see?
Yeah, you know what? I prepared that slide in case you'd ask.
Oh, good.
I'll tell you what, I was amazed that third-party candidates have a hard time getting things going. And here are some of the reasons. There's a lot of federal campaign finance laws, rules that dictate who can enter presidential debates, and the lack of media attention, as we refer to. Also, a lot of paperwork goes into becoming a candidate. When Ralph Nader announced his candidacy, whether you liked him or not, the guy had a lot of diligence. He would seek the presidential nomination. He was required to collect 1.5 million signatures in all the states to be just to appear on the ballot. Okay? So the deadlines for those signatures would begin as early as May 2004 in his case. And notice February is when he was thinking about it. So it's a short time frame to get a candidacy running. And also, campaign finance rules say that a political party can only get government funding to run a race, to your point, if it received a certain percentage of votes from the previous election. So that was important too, to have a precedent set. Yes, that's a good point. But I would say that third parties really in this country they're not getting that precedent. And I don't know in our history in the next 20, 30 years if it will. It will. But in the next 100 years it may. You know, we may emerge. We used to have the Whig Party, Republican and Democrat. We kind of gravitated toward two. So there could be a change down the road. Who knows on that one? I'm not sure if I answered your question completely. Anybody else? Well, I appreciate you coming out. If you ever want to stop out at St. Mary's University, come on over. We'll give you a tour. We're right off of Park Avenue in Minneapolis. So thanks for having me come out. I appreciate it.